Hello, it's your host, Todd Lewis, the Praise of Folly podcast. Do not forget to like, share, and subscribe, and hit the notification bell. Follow me on Facebook, Telegram, and Twitter, and you can support me on Subscribestar, Locals, and Buy Me a Coffee. All those links are in the low bar. As this is also an AMA, anybody is free to ask questions. Of course, if you want to guarantee that I get to your questions, I will read super chats first. So this actually was sort of inspired by Wandering Panda, because I was having a bit of a writer's block, so to speak. Couldn't really come up with an idea for a show. And he's like, just talk about books that influenced you. I'm like, well, that's a good idea. That's a good thing to talk about. And now I think he said between first and fifth grade, but I don't remember much when I was reading at that age. But overall, though, there's a lot of books that have influenced me over the years. The one that influenced me the most, obviously, is the Bible. That's the one that has influenced me the most, the one that I've read the most, and the one that as a Christian forms the foundation for my life. I think a helpful way to describe how oftentimes people are going to tell you the Bible anchors their life, but they don't necessarily go into the details. And so it's a little like, okay, we know what an anchor is, but like, how does it anchor your life? Well, many who watch this channel and are involved in the idea space realize that society is, in the midst of hyperreality, liquid modernity, and deterritorialization, where everything is in flux, right? There's no fixed point. Everything is moving around you, right? And so, on the one hand, the Bible provides a fixed point. It provides that foundation on which everything else revolves around, right? Whereas, now we don't really have a fixed point. Existentialism in most forms, except the Christian one, which would, of course, ground things in a biblical, in the Bible and in God's word, would say that you just choose your own center. I mean, you can do that, but that's not actually going to make it so. If I look at, say, the facade of a building on a movie set and say, well, that's the building, doesn't make it so. It's just something that you choose to believe, right? But there's something also, I think, a little more abstract that people miss. So as we're all moving through this liquid modernity and we're, trying to figure out where we stand in the world and get to the place that we want to go, right? One of the things that Nietzsche says is that, well, look, we all have to make this sort of, quote, existential decision to figure out, what we're going to do. So part of the idea behind the transvaluation of ethics is that all of the old sources of truth, not just religion, right? He also criticizes, in many cases, how science is developed, belief in the state, and other things as not, now, he wouldn't have used the Baudrillardian term of science signal drift or anything like that, but he argues that either A, nobody believes in them now, like in Thus Spoke Zarathustra, or nobody believed in them ever. That's a more deeper claim he makes. And then we just have to, swim in the middle of the ocean and grab onto some driftwood and figure out what we're going to do. Well, we still have to go somewhere. And one of my objections to Nietzsche was, okay, look, let's say that Nietzsche's right, that we're just stuck in the middle of the ocean with driftwood. And you have to figure out what to do. And that's just a prescriptive claim or descriptive claim. That's just how things are. Okay, fine. That's just how things are. But if your goal is to find solid ground and get out of the ocean, there still needs to be a broader framework in which that decision is made. Nietzsche does not provide that. And in general, existentialism does not provide that unless, of course, it's Christian existentialism. So Dostoevsky or Kierkegaard are good examples of Christian existentialist thinkers. And in that regard, I've been heavily influenced by also Kierkegaard and Dostoevsky. So in college, I read Fear and Trembling by Kierkegaard. And I read many Dostoevsky novels, The Idiot, Crime and Punishment. I've not read Notes from the Underground, and that's quite popular and famous. And so one of the things that Kierkegaard and Dostoevsky do, combining the philosophical and the religious text, is that not only do they accept the reality that we're struggling in this period of flux, both of whom, Dostoevsky specifically also influenced Nietzsche. Nietzsche loved many of his books as keen psychological analysis. So the question then becomes, what's the framework under which we act? And then also, what's the goal that we're aiming at? Now, I would argue that for me and for others, the Bible serves that role. And so, in that regard, that's the most important book that's impacted my life. And I think this is what, because a lot of people who look at Christians or evangelicals or whatever, and they're like, okay, well, what does the Bible mean for you? And you get some padded, boilerplate position, which doesn't really answer the question and doesn't really tell people what they're interested in knowing. And it's also not practical. So the question then becomes, okay, well, how does the Bible practically influence or practically help you? Well, so, okay, this is an obvious example. It's a really easy example. All of the negative consequences of a sexually liberated society were already known and spelled out in the Bible. Nobody had to try this out and see what would happen. We already knew what would happen. And if you just follow those rules, you avoid all the externalities. There were plenty of people that, quote, didn't know any better and just bumbled around, and they're like, yeah, I goofed up in my 20s and 13s and 20s, but it's too late now, right? If you had this knowledge and lived by it at the beginning, you would have avoided all of those problems. And you could just repeat that through any number of examples. So to reiterate, why is the Bible important to me? How is it a book that's influenced my life? Well, it influenced my life because it gives you the framework in which to make decisions while you're holding onto the driftwood in the middle of the ocean, in Nietzsche's Crisis of Meaning. Then it also gives you an endpoint to strive for. So as you learn about yourself and the environment around you and take on this existential quest, you can get out of this mess. And that's where Dostoevsky and Kierkegaard come in. And I've read their books as well. They've tremendously influenced me. So I think we'll move over to Dostoevsky. The Brothers Karamazov is obviously one of the greatest books ever written. One of the greatest sections of that book is The Grand Inquisitor, where Dostoevsky has a stinging critique of the Catholic Church, and he makes a very it's actually unusual for Orthodox to make this, but I guess that means Dostoevsky is rising above his own limitations. There's a line where it says, when we took Caesar's sword in purple, we rejected you. That's the Great Inquisitor saying to Christ, we rejected him. And there's a lot of deep commentary in there. But also, too, there's the broader story of the brothers, right? And the meta commentary on atheism, where Ivan says, without God, anything is permissible. Those are all important aspects of the Brothers Karamazov. The Demons is another book that I've read where he goes on a much, much deeper dive into atheism. And there's a chilling moment in the book where one of the revolutionaries says, we'll have to kill 100 million Europeans to make socialism work. Now, the Black Book of Communism says 100 million people died all over the world. That's kind of chilling that he was ballparking the death toll just about right. Now, the target was wrong. It wasn't Europe per se. It was the whole world and then parts of Eastern Europe. But still, that's a really chilling prediction there. The interesting thing about the idiot is, in many ways, the idiot is a sort of, obviously Dostoevsky is a Christian, so the idea of a perfectly good man suffering the way the idiot does is based on Christ's life, right? But also it's based on what Plato said in, I think it's the Republic, a perfectly good man would be killed by society, which is, again, foreshadowing because Plato's writing about the death of Socrates. The death of Socrates has already happened, right? So there's this dialogue with both the biblical themes of Christ's life and the idiot, and then also what Plato's talking about with Socrates. So you could see Dostoevsky is weighing in on this as well. And he's such a keen observer of psychological motivations. So people will say, oh, this is why I'm doing X, but they could be deliberately lying. They could be confused about their true motivation, or they may not just be thinking at all, and they're just, it's just the thing you say. And Dostoevsky cuts right through that. And so, in a sense, the practical utility with Dostoevsky is once you understand the basic psychology of human behavior, and he's writing from the point of view of an industrial society. It's Russia in the beginning days of the Industrial Revolution, but still, it shows us how people think, even in a modern context, not just in an ancient or medieval context. So that is helpful in a practical sense. It helps you look at other people and then be like, okay, that's why they're thinking or doing what they say they're thinking or doing. Well, we're talking about the Russians, so we can't leave out Leo Tolstoy. I read War and Peace, I read Anna Karenina, and I read The Resurrection, and many of his short stories. And Tolstoy is a world figure like Shakespeare or Homer. I mean, he's Russian, but he transcends Russia. What he does is he has the big picture, the grand sweep. So whereas there's a sense in which Dostoevsky's novels are subjective, and by subjective I mean based on the feelings and perceptions of the subject, not that they're morally ambiguous or there's no morality at all. It's from the point of view of the subject, right? So it tends to have a quote smaller scope. The bigness of scope comes from the ideas, whether it's the justification for the murder of the landlady in Crime and Punishment, whether it's the revolutionary activities in The Demons, or whether it's the philosophical musings of Ivan or Alyosha and the brothers Karamazov. So the scale is physically small, but it's vast on the intellectual level because it's psychological. Tolstoy is physically vast. War and Peace has over 3,000 characters. It goes, I think, from 1805 Austerlitz to, well, the end of the Napoleonic Wars, but there's like a postscript where everybody's married and has families and they're happy. I forget exactly when that takes place, the late 1810s, I would guess. But he has this big sweeping perspective. You see the same with Anna Karenina, and you see the same with The Resurrection. And The Resurrection, because it's about someone who was arrested and goes to Siberia, you get a sense of the vastness of Siberia and the vastness of Russia and of the Russian bureaucracy, because that's where Tolstoy brutally criticizes the Russian bureaucracy. Now, that's not to say that Tolstoy doesn't have an understanding for character development or characterization. One of the things that Tolstoy is famous for is for getting inside the heads of women and writing compelling psychological profiles for the women in his stories, such that female readers are like, wow, how did this guy do that? So he's also very good at psychologizing as well, but it's a little different, right? He's not necessarily giving you the reasons why they do what they do, which is what Dostoevsky does. He's giving you just accurately describing how women would act at any given situation. And, there's so many different characters. In War and Peace, he has a theory of history. Now, of course, he's more of a Russian patriot and nationalist when he's writing War and Peace and when he's writing Anna Karenina. He has his, midlife crisis and becomes more of a religious ascetic and is very critical of the Russian regime. And we see this in The Resurrection. And in that regard, all of this shows us that Tolstoy has this breadth and width of knowledge. He's a keen social critic. And of course, the short stories, which are both religious devotionals on the one hand and social criticism on the other, are very incisive. So, yeah, I had to, once we opened the door to Russia, I had to go to Tolstoy. Let's see. In the chat, we have Caravaggio. Hello, Todd. In regards to your thesis of mortar magic versus elf magic, which books influenced your thinking, other than Tolkien, of course? Oh, that's a good question. Let me think about that a little bit. Well, okay, so this is a bit of an easy answer, and I'm just developing it. Obviously, in Narnia, we have a similar magical schema, right? What makes the magic of Aslan good, right? And then the witch bad, right? And we see this in The Lion, the Witch, and the Wardrobe and The Magician's Nephew. Well, there's a lot of the same underlying principles, right? The witch is trying to dominate people's wills, right? And in the Magician's Nephew, she boasts of using the deplorable word to kill everybody on her planet because her sister was leading a coup d'etat against her, right? And that's interesting too, because the argument that, great men can break the rules and, be immoral on a prudential basis I was first introduced to that thinking when I read Crime and Punishment, where Raskolnikov makes such arguments, and then the wit Jadis makes similar arguments in The Magician's Nephew. So you could say you go from Dostoevsky to Lewis to Tolkien, and all of these principles are there. It's the Mordor magic is where you're going to use force to coerce or compel other people to your will, and also exempt yourselves from any sort of moral position that you would hold others to. Right? That's that. And then, of course, Aslan's creative magic when he creates Narnia at the beginning of The Magician's Nephew and the lamp post that's planted there, and how everything just sort of has this fecundity to it, which eventually dissipates, is the idea that it's a sort of giving. The white magic of Narnia is where the heroes, or Aslan, gives of himself to then give power to others, and then it's returned with interest. We see this in The Lion, the Witch, and the Wardrobe, where Aslan says, if the witch had known, she knows the deep magic, but if she'd known what was before the creation of Narnia, that if an innocent man takes the place of a guilty one, then time will roll backwards and death will be reversed. Right. So it's this idea of giving. And while I don't know if the elves develop this as much, there is a sense that the elves are very open-handed. All the good guys in Middle Earth are very open-handed. So it's not so much as with Aslan and Jardis is like commentary on this stuff, whereas in Middle Earth it's just assumed. There's some commentary, but the elves don't give a whole lot. It's something you just learn by reading and observing and absorbing, right? Let me think. What other sources of magic? I'll have to come back to that. That's just for starters. The other thing that hugely influenced me were the Sherlock Holmes stories. I believe it was in high school one summer. I read them all. I read all the short stories. I think it was like 48, and then the 4 novellas. So I mean, it was a lot of reading, and I learned a lot. That's what taught me how to think before I'd even read a logic textbook. You kind of learn it through osmosis because Sherlock Holmes is a very logical, analytical thinker. So what sort of got me to correlate my own ways of thinking with what I read in Sherlock Holmes all those years ago was when I was watching with my family. We were watching the Sherlock Holmes Jeremy Brett. And I believe it was The Dancing Men. He's looking for a third bullet. I won't go into the explanation. It's pretty clever, though. And he says he was looking for it because he deduced from the evidence that he had heard that there had to be this third bullet, which the police weren't even looking for. And it struck me at that moment as I was watching it. This is how I've been trying to solve problems. And I just realized, I was so young, a lot of those stories just kind of were not present in my mind, but they influenced me in a very profound way. And arguably after the Bible, I'd say the works of Sir Arthur Conan Doyle's Sherlock Holmes were the second most influential in my life. And basically that's teaching you how to observe, how to think and deduce and solve problems. That's self-evidently practical. I don't think I need to justify that. Lord Commander of the Realm, hello there. Hope you're doing well. Have you read the Silmarillion? If so, what's your 2 favorite stories from the book? Oh, well, thank you. I'm doing great. I have read the Silmarillion many times. 2 favorite stories, Beren and Luthien and Turin and Turambar. Those are my 2 favorite. Turin is sort of the Greek tragedy, and it's a really moving story. And this guy is, cursed by Morgoth. Well, his father's cursed, which means the whole family's cursed. And by Tolkien's own admission, Beren and Luthien is sort of the centerpiece story of the Silmarillion. It sort of summarizes or consummates all of his ideas into one story. And there's so many great moments. I mean, the battle between Han and Sauron on the bridge, I think, of Minas Tirith. And then you have the going into Morgoth, going into Thingor Odrum, and then Luthien putting everyone to sleep so Baron can take a Silmaril. And then, of course, Karkaroth, the great werewolf that bites off his hand. I mean, there's so many really just powerful moments in that. Chiron, God Emperor of. Bad teachers can ruin good books. It took me years to give Crime and Punishment a second chance. Any you like now, but not at first read. Yeah, that's true. That's true. For me, I had a Thomist professor who ruined Aquinas for me. But I haven't really read, I mean, I haven't read a lot of Aquinas, but after college, I was like, well, okay, hold up. Let's give the guy his due, right? Just because the professor was a jackwagon doesn't mean that his favorite medieval philosopher was no good. So I looked at some other lecture courses and stuff. I'm like, okay, I'm not gonna swear by the guy, but it is very easy to get caught up. And if you have a professor that sucks, or is bad, or is offensive, and it's hard to differentiate, the content of what that professor is arguing for from his bad character. That's very true. That's very true. Probably the third most important books would be The Lord of the Rings, obviously, because what Tolkien gives in The Lord of the Rings is this idea that you have to wait for the eucatastrophe, the idea that things might be bad, but if you stay the course and do the right thing, eventually there's going to be a shift in the weather, right? And we see this, the build up to the Battle of Pelennor Fields, where both the Rohirrim, the ships that bring Aragorn and his men over to Pelennor Fields, I think Gandalf and Minas Tirith, they all notice the change in the weather from different perspectives, kind of like a Rashomon moment, where you have the same event being experienced by multiple different observers. It's a very clever way of doing it. I don't know if Tolkien saw Rashomon. Rashomon came out, I think, in 1950. It's a clever device that existed before Rashomon, so it's not like he has to have seen it. And so with that, what I'd say is, well, look, it's really important that you have this sort of, well, they don't call it fate in The Lord of the Rings. They call it doom. This idea that you've been born in a time where you just have to endure a struggle, right? That's where in the movie it's in Moria, but in the books it's in Bag End, where Gandalf says it's not for us to decide. It's not for us to choose when we live, but to decide what to do with what we have at the time, right? And that's a very powerful message. And then you have the broader eucatastrophe perspective backed up by a cast of heroes, which inspires you to keep going. So that, and also too, Tolkien has a very highly cultivated, developed aesthetic sense. And that's something as well that has been highly influential for me as well. So this is, so Sherlock Holmes is number 2 because that taught me how to solve problems, observe, and all that stuff. Tolkien, I guess you could say, so if Doyle taught me how to think, Tolkien taught me how to feel. Tolkien's like, okay, this is the stuff that you should feel in these given situations. These are things that are good, things that are bad, and this is how you react to them in a sort of like moral didactic sense. And also taught you to hope. So that's huge. That's 3 books, but you know what I mean. The fourth most influential would be Isaac Asimov's The Foundation trilogy. I read recently Foundation's Edge, but I didn't read that when I was a kid. When I was 14, I read the Foundation trilogy because, well, sci-fi is cool, and this guy is going to use history and merge it with sci-fi with this idea called psychohistory, where you could use knowledge of history and psychological trends to project into the future. And Asimov had been inspired to write this after reading Gibbon's Decline and Fall of the Roman Empire. And he's like, okay, but what if we had somebody building an organization that was trying to fight the, quote, rise in entropy of the fall while the empire still exists, and then into that post-imperial state. And about 3 years ago, I was like, well, I look at the situation like that now. I mean, America is a collapsing civilization. people who watch my channel know that I'm a collapsitarian. So the idea is, thinking about how to lay the foundations for what comes next is something I've been doing since then. And it struck me the only thing that I'd ever read that ever exposed me to this idea was Asimov. So I reread Asimov, and it was incredible. So when I was a kid, he was using a lot of high level logic. Well, first of all, I was 14, so some of the history I hadn't even read yet, as well as the fact that he was making very complex arguments that I was not able to follow at the time. And I was beginning to realize, given how his work had influenced my line of thought for so long, I was like, well, now I'm older, now I'm wiser, now I'm probably able to understand what he's talking about. Let's go back and reread it and see what I missed. Because I was looking for a more character-driven story, whereas he's, at that point, those three stories are more idea-driven. And I was rewarded with the follow-up reading. So that would be my fourth most influential, because it taught me how to... It's closely related to Doyle, because if Doyle teaches you how to think and reason and observe the present, how can you project what you know about the present into the future? Which is a precondition for building civilization as such. Well, 14-year-old me was reading Isaac Asimov, and Asimov did a very creative way of merging that with science fiction. Also, too, I think if we look at the three great science fiction authors, Isaac Asimov, Arthur C. Clarke, and Frank Herbert, with their series of books. Herbert, okay, so, and you look at the sort of like moral message, right? Asimov has a very highly developed moral philosophy, which is akin to some of the most sophisticated elements of esoteric thought, even though it's science fiction. I have not read Clarke, though I think Clarke also kind of leans in that direction from what I have heard. And then Herbert is very, I think, muddled in comparison to specifically Asimov. I mean, Asimov is a clearly formulated moral philosophy and a clearly formulated philosophy of history. Now, Dune is also giving you a philosophy of history, specifically God Emperor of Dune with Leto II's 10,000-year rule, but it's really nowhere near well thought out as Asimov. Asimov is a much more well thought out view of history progressing over time. And of course, he gives us one of the greatest, well, I don't know if I'd call him a villain, maybe anti-hero is a better word, of all time, the Mule. He sort of introduces into the jargon of science fiction and science the idea of the mentalists or the psychics. And for those who've watched some of my recent videos as well, that is heavily, my mental science, my spiritual science. A lot of that's heavily influenced by Asimov as well. So get full spectrum influence with this guy. So let's just put a bookmark in this and recap the four major influences, right? The Bible would be using, as a Christian existentialist, what I'd say is the Bible is the focusing lens. The focus is what we have to do while we're floating in the ocean, holding onto a piece of driftwood, and Nietzsche's crisis of meaning. But it also provides us a mode of action and a goal to strive for in a way that other existentialist movements and ideas don't have. They're not as old or rooted. And frankly, it's ridiculous to think that you have to reinvent the wheel in your own lifetime. That's physically not possible. Thousands of years of history have occurred where people have wrote down things and experienced things. There is no way that in your lifetime, you're going to be able to do that. The Bible is one such deposit. Number two, a collected work of Sherlock Holmes by Sir Arthur Conan Doyle, because what that does is it taught me how to observe, to think, to hypothesize, and to reason. Thirdly would be Tolkien and Middle-earth in general. You could say, Lord of the Rings, The Hobbit, Silmarillion, all of that good stuff. That taught me how to feel and hope. So the eucatastrophe is hope. Don't give up hope. Do the right thing in the moment and keep going. And then, Tolkien showed you what's evil and what's good, what's beautiful and what's ugly. And he correctly calibrates your aesthetic preferences. Fourthly, Isaac Asimov's The Foundation trilogy, because that also teaches you how to think. but in a very narrower sense, right? It's not the process of thinking like Sherlock Holmes, but it's thinking about the future of civilization. And you do that by using what you know of the past, i.e. the decline and fall of the Roman Empire, right? But also what you know about science in the present, and you try to project that into the future. As well as the idea, well, what is the power of the mind? What can the mind do? What can the mind not do? Asimov expands your consciousness so that you begin to see the mind and its powers in a different light. So those four collections of books, because that's really what we're talking about, are probably the most influential in my life. Now, that's not to say there aren't others. For example, I love Beowulf. I've probably read that 4 or 5 times. Generally considered the first piece of English literature. So Beowulf is great. Beowulf is it. Well, that teaches you how to be a hero, right? Beowulf fights Grendel, Grendel's mother, and the dragon. And in the end, he sacrifices himself to defeat the dragon to save his people after he becomes king. So that is it's short, it's to the point, you're not going to have this grand sweeping Russian psychological drama, but you are going to get a clear and concise definition of what a hero is. And this is a hero that is in this middle ground between Christianity and paganism. The author is writing in the Christian era in Britain, but he's writing about a time before the Christian era. And so Beowulf embodies a lot of the heroic qualities, but from the point of view of a Christian, right? So, he himself might not have been a Christian even in the story. He doesn't do a lot of the pagan-y things like, rapine and pillage and all the pagan-y things that other heroes would have done in Viking sagas. So you can definitely tell that they're softening the heroic archetype from a Christian point POV. And also can't forget Art of War. Sun Tzu's The Art of War. Man, maybe I should have put that a little bit higher up. His dictum, know yourself and know your enemy. You not for the result of 100 battles. I put to good use at all my debating on YouTube. Many on my channel, but for those who've been around the whole time, I don't lose debates, and that's why. Because I don't remember how old I was. In the aughties, there was a lot of like samurai-themed content, films, TV shows, documentaries. And the Art of War is kind of all bundled up in that. And so I was exposed to all of that. That was hugely influential to me. And the idea then so I guess we're going to shift to my competitive side. That's where the Art of War comes in. The Art of War is like, okay, if you're going to be competitive, and again, this could also hold for sports or business, whatever. War is just the highest stakes competition because if you lose, you die. You have to know your enemy and know yourself. Also, his section on spies, gathering intelligence, right? Now, I don't have an army of spies at my disposal, but I gather intelligence, right? That's what a spy does. And so you spend a lot of time getting to know the beliefs and the ideas of your opponent, which is what you get from the spy chapter. And so you put that to use. And generally, also the other aphorism, to win without fighting is the highest goal of a warrior, of a soldier, or of a state, which is interesting because that the whole thing is the art of war, right? So but he says that war is expensive and that if you do fight it, you should fight it on the other guy's territory to plunder his resources. So I think what he's getting at with that in part is that, look, this is expensive. If the state can find a better way of achieving its goals, it should. And that has a similarity with Isaac Asimov's aphorism in the Foundation series, violence is the last refuge of the incompetent, which is a refrain throughout the Foundation trilogy. I'm not saying that's influenced by the Art of War's statement it's better to win without fighting, but it certainly embodies that feeling, that sentiment. Another influential book would have been Musashi's The Book of Five Rings. In there, one thing that I remember, and I've always remembered, even if I forgot most of what was in that book, was he said when he talks about what it means to be a warrior. He says that a warrior is someone who embraces their duty and is willing to die for that duty, which means not only your classic samurai, but a peasant, a woman, or a child could also be possessed of the warrior spirit. And so I think that's probably where my warrior spirit came from. I'm like, okay, well, I don't have to be, a samurai or from the caste to have that spirit, right? You just channel it yourself. And so, Musashi was important as well. Also, I don't know if it was in a book per se, probably was though. This idea that okay, so let's look at the sword master Musashi, and then let's look at American competitive sports, right? What usually happens with American competitive sports is you have people that find a team that they like, a fighting style that they like, and they master their style, not necessarily the other guys. I mean, to some degree they have to, right? But what they do is they just try to and then work that angle as long as they can. Whereas the Japanese duelist is different. He's going to look at this from a totally different perspective. He's going to say, okay, let's look at all the fighting tactics of my opponent. And then you could sort of build a mental image in your head of where all the sword strokes are going to go. And then you position yourself where he's not going to hit you, right? Once somebody's been drilled into a fighting style, they can't just on the dime stop fighting that way. So you position yourself to be least exposed to these strikes. And then you develop a strike that he can't counter because you've seen all of his moves. That's not how Americans do competitive work, but that's how the Japanese duelist did it, right? The samurai. I probably got that from Musashi or somebody from that period. And that's really important too, because we're going to tie this all into energy, right? It's all about energy conservation. Sun Tzu says wars are expensive. It's better to win without fighting. Asimov says violence is the last refuge of the incompetent. Musashi and other samurai masters argue that you need to step out of the sort of visceral experience of the fight, right? You need to be somewhere else mentally. I mean, physically you're still there, right? But you're mentally somewhere else. A good example of this would be is if you watch the original Dragon Ball Z, when the Ginyu Force shows up, there was that little green guy that looks kind of like puffy, like a pufferfish. He could pause time. And when he paused time by holding his breath, he could then outmaneuver anyone. And then when he released the breath, time would start again. And everybody would go, whoa, where'd he go? It's sort of like that, but it's all mental, right? And you don't actually stop time. But from the point of view of the guy you're fighting, it looks like that little green dude from the Ginyu Force just disappearing, going bye-bye. So there's that, right? You tie all of this together. Oh yeah, and then of course standing outside of your opponent's fighting style. And not only standing outside of his fighting style, you're standing outside of the fight itself, so that you have this superposition from, well, what would be called the Tao, the way, or reality, and you can then look down and then defeat him in a single move, a single strike. And that's what the great samurai would do. And that's sort of how I roll. I don't waste time in the sort of pugilism where you just keep punching people like, Rocky or something. It doesn't do anything. You want to find that superposition where he can't strike you, and you've got the unblockable move, and then bam, that's it. All right, let's see. We got some direct questions I need to get to. Seamus O'Blaine, what books that cover the spiritual science that was developing? Yes. Okay, there are a few. When you read Sherlock Holmes, okay, Doyle is giving you so for example, the idea of the brain attic, which you get in The Study in Scarlet, is actually a distillation of a classical conception and philosophy of mental visualization, where you view your mind as a room that you put objects in, and these objects are objects of thought, and you move them around and you vision them in your mind. Okay, now he's popularizing an already established mode of thought. This isn't supernatural or paranormal, but there are authors who write what I call paranormal detective stories, and they give every impression of popularizing an already existing body of work. Now, I'm not really aware of this body of work. I haven't read it, but clearly they had, and they are articulating it in the story. We have Arthur Machen with his Dyson series, Dyson the Occult Investigator. We have William Pope Hodgson with Carnacki the Ghost Hunter. And we have Algernon Blackwood, John Silence series, all of which are very good. These are detective stories. They're sort of, they read sort of like Sherlock Holmes, right? But they're still analytical, but they're comparatively less analytical because we're dealing with speculative, spiritual, and mental forces. Those have been highly influential recently in my life. I read all the John Silence stories. I read all the Carnacki stories, and I read all the Dyson stories. They're great. They're really good. You should read them. And they help set that up. Wandering Panda. Let's see. Do you have favorites outside of primary influences? Just books and authors you enjoy. Yeah, I think that's a distinction I would not usually make. I actually really do enjoy reading Tolkien because I like reading Tolkien, right? I mean, partly because I enjoy reading him so much, that's how he became such a powerful influence in my life. You read a guy enough and you almost feel like you know him, right? So let's see. But yeah, is there anything that I read for fun that doesn't really have a hugely influential impact on my life? That's a good question because I try to read books that are going to be influential and important in my life rather than just reading books that are entertaining for the sake of entertaining. It was fun. There was a book that I read. Oh, what was it called? Wow, I can't even remember it. It was a book about magic in England set during the 19th century, during the Napoleonic Wars. And it became a TV show, a series. I can't remember it now. It was about two magicians or two wizards. It was fun. I probably wouldn't read it again, but yeah, it was fun for what it was. But I don't think I'd read it again. What other stories? What else? See, I think to sort of go meta on your question, Wandering Panda, is when I read something, I try to read it I try to read works that are mutually reinforcing in the sense that we don't have a culture anymore, right? But in a healthy, well-structured culture, what do you do? Well, everything that you do, from eating to sleeping to working to leisure to starting a family, is all mutually reinforcing. So it all feeds back. It's a feedback loop back on itself. Well, we don't have that anymore. So it has to be constructed. And so in that case, yeah, I usually do that. And I'll explain why. Modern literature, as we all know, is garbage. And when I was younger, I read books I liked and I read books that were garbage. And I'm like, okay, how do I tell the difference? Well, somehow in the early 2000s, I came across the literary critic Harold Bloom, who had a list of the Western canon. And I was like, oh, I'll read these. Now, obviously, I didn't read his entire list. It's massive. But the idea of the canon was powerful to me because it indicated that we have this received wisdom of accepted truths that are reinforcing, that go back a very long time. And so I generally read with that eye. Like, I'm not the kind of guy that's going to read a bunch of comic books or superficial literature just to pad out the time. I'm just not going to do that. Thank you, Seamus O'Blaine. Jonathan Strange and Mr. Norrell. Exactly. That was delightfully funny in places. The only thing that marred it was a few feminist comments here and there, but overall there weren't that many. And it was a lot of humor, a lot of dry British humor. So it's probably worth at least one read. It was fun. But yeah, there was that. Let's see. There's so many books though. Let's do something that's not fiction, because The Art of War is not fiction. Aristotle's Politics and the Nicomachean Ethics, hugely influential in my life. So if we view Aristotle as a political scientist, what he says in the Politics is like a template, a foundation, right? Cicero builds on that foundation. Dante builds on that foundation. Machiavelli builds on that foundation. And the American Founding Fathers build on that foundation. And so in that regard, what I would say then is that's where my foundation is. Now, of course, I've grown beyond what's in the Politics, but it's important. It's really important. And then also we have the Nicomachean Ethics, where specifically his chapters on friendship were very influential to me. That's where I sort of fell in love with the idea of philia, the Greek term for friendship, the love of the soul, which we see in the Bible with David and Jonathan. So Aristotle's been a hugely influential author in my life. And there's more I could say, but I mean, there's Aristotle. There's so much you could say about him. Wandering Panda, I'm a little surprised I haven't heard anything about Shakespeare yet. That's a good point. I've read all of Shakespeare's histories, tragedies, a few of his comedies, and I think I read all of his romances. That's a grab bag where you have like The Tempest, Time on of Athens. Yeah, Shakespeare's great. Shakespeare's amazing. The thing that Shakespeare does, so like Tolkien, Shakespeare has this sort of like moral aesthetic quality, right? It teaches you what used to be called ordering your desires or refining your aesthetic preferences. He does that quite well. He's got complex, interlocking moral cause and effect. We see that with King Lear. Really good example of that. We see what is it? Let's focus it on the tragedy. But you could say that all the histories are a tragedy too, because England goes through the Civil War because of actions done by Henry Bolingbroke and Richard II. So the whole histories could be seen as a tragedy as well, because it ends with the brutal Richard. Well, a comedy means a happy ending. So maybe Richard III is maybe it's a comedy because it ends with the death of Richard. But what tragedies show you and what the histories show you is, okay, so when actions occur, the people perform an action, the result might not be noticed for centuries in some cases. And so, how are you going to build a mental model of cause and effect for actions? Well, this action causes that effect, and this effect causes that effect. Well, these sort of highly structured didactic morality tales and tragedies, for example, Shakespearean tragedies, shows us what actions will do over a lifetime without you having to live the lifetime. So it's a sort of like shorthand for figuring all this out. Like, oh, okay, that's how that works. I think I had a poll recently where I said in the 3 categories of comedy, tragedy, history, what's your favorite? And in that order, I said The Merchant of Venice, Julius Caesar, and Henry V. Why? Well, The Merchant of Venice is great. Shylock is a great villain. I like the friendship of Antonio and Bassanio. It reminds me of Aristotelian friendship. That's a very powerful connection there. Bassanio's love interest, Portia, her father has a very clever test that any suitor has to pass because he's dead. It was in his will that they'd have to pass in order to win her hand. It's a very clever test. I was impressed by the cleverness of Shakespeare's storytelling there. Julius Caesar, to me, is just a quintessential tragedy. It's just so larger than life and grand at every level. It was also the first Shakespeare play I read. But yeah, it was really good. I really liked that. There's so many great places. It's hard to pick a favorite part of Julius Caesar. It's just a solid play. Henry V, again, solid play. Love St. Crispin's Day speech. That's great. That's amazing. Oh wow. Yeah, I'm surprised I didn't bring up Lovecraft either. Record deepness. Hello, would you consider doing a talk on the works of Clark Ashton Smith to a similar vein as the ones on Lovecraft? Yes, I have considered that, and I will. just not at the moment. I still have to digest the Smith stuff that I've read. Though a Verona series is great. Zothic is great. Definitely check it out. Lovecraft and Smith, what do they teach? Well, they teach you... Okay. It's going to get a little meta here. If you look at Doyle's definition of analytical reasoning, observing some reality and then reasoning the cause that brought it there, the chain of events that brought it there, you then have this, what chain of events produced the horrors of Lovecraft? And I think what Lovecraft and Smith and some of these other, edgy, well, not edgy, misunderstood geniuses were getting at was the sort of like mental horror of technology, of industrial civilization, but they couldn't like pinpoint it, right? They couldn't pinpoint the cause. All they could write about was their own subjective experiences of that horror and these creative stories. And so what Lovecraft did for me, and then Smith is accompanies all this, is in order... Okay, this is really meta. In order to reason backwards from let's say you read a Call of Cthulhu. Where does all that come from? Well, clearly Lovecraft had experiences. Lovecraft read stuff. He's very widely read. I mean, in a Call of Cthulhu, he makes all sorts of historical references. There's scientific references. I mean, this guy was a polymath. But then you have to ask yourself, how do you come up with Cthulhu? This like gelatinous monster with like an octopus head and all this other stuff. And it's like, well, I think part of where it's coming from, well, first of all, an author, when he writes a book, it comes from two sources, his mind and his heart. He feels something and he thinks something. And those two things converge in the book. So then the question is, you have to ask, well, what was he thinking? What was he feeling? I don't entirely know, but I think the obvious deduction is that he was feeling a lot of what we're feeling now about the late stage industrial society. And he wrote about it in a way that was creative and allowed him to say it in a way that people could get, right? So for example, it's often a trope that, like in fiction and in a modern time, specifically science fiction, you can write social commentary in a pretty bold and daring way, but people don't get angry because they're all fictional space aliens or whatever, right? So Lovecraft is writing about monsters. You could tie this into monsters from the id, like in the Forbidden Planet, where this ancient alien race develops psychic technology that brings to life everything that they're thinking about. But because they were super hyper rational, they believed they didn't have an id. And well, that machine they built awoke the id and destroyed them, the crowd. There you go. Probably what's going on with Lovecraft, right? Now, he's, I think, aware of this id influence, but what are you going to do with it? I don't think he knows the cause, but somehow that's what it's being generated. So by internalizing all of that, it helped me look at the situation we're in and imagine things differently so that when I do look at the realities around us, I'm like, hey, you know what? This thing that Lovecraft talks about actually helps understand all this. I can't think of anything on top of my head at the moment, but that has been the case. And Southern Reactionary. Hey, Todd. Love the list of books so far. Well, thank you. Thank you very much. And while we're on the vein of Lovecraft, I'll talk about some of my favorite Lovecraft stories. His two longest works, The Case of Charles Dexter Ward from his Cthulhu Mythos cycle, and The Dream Quest of Unknown Kadath from the Dream Quest cycle are my two favorite works. And they're both actual novels. They're not just novellas, they're novels. And they're great. They're absolutely great. Oh, okay. Yeah, okay. This is how reading Lovecraft can help you understand the world we live in now. When at the end of spoiler alert, but I don't really care about spoilers on this show. At the end of The Case of Charles Dexter Ward, the doctor, the family physician who's the protagonist of the story, who defeats the wizard Joseph Curwen, realizes that he has to have imagination. He has to have imagination to believe that what his ward, Charles Dexter, was saying and writing about, and then the realization that these wizards that didn't die using black magic were real, and they kidnapped this kid and were plotting some nefarious thing. You know, one of the common themes in a Lovecraft story is most people are like, oh, that's ridiculous. You have to psychoanalyze the guy to explain it away as nothing. But this guy just believes. And then the creative element, the idea that you have to have this imagination that you could do this, ties in with Sherlock Holmes, because I think it's the case of Silver Blaze. He talks about the importance of imagination, where you imagine something happening, then looking for the evidence that it happened. And if you find that evidence, you keep going down that line. And so imagining that you have this like almost like shadow reality that is affecting us. Not always for the ill, because the dream cycle with the POV character of Lovecraft, Randolph Carter, is good. It's nice. It's, you know, there's some horrors in it, like in the Dream Quest of Unknown Kadath, but it's generally a nice place because it's, you know, his dream world, right? So the idea that there's this shadow or substitute, this other world parallel to ours that influences ours in ways we can't perceive, in one sense, is always been the case with religion. But the ways in which we're being influenced now are not ways in which traditional religion really talks about, because it wasn't happening, or it wasn't happening very much. Lovecraft does, and that's why you should read him, because he helps you see how this parallel shadow world that exists alongside ours is able to do that. And it's not that there's any one discrete thing, though there might be. It's that it's a general mental exercise to think in that way. The other mental exercise that you get when you read, for example, the Dream Quest, which the Doomsman and I last year did an episode where we analyzed the entire Dream Quest cycle. A really good watch. You should watch it. Is there's a sense in which thinking about pleasant things in the midst of the Lovecraftian horrors of our own day has a kind of cathartic effect, right? That thing that we're looking for that we don't have yet isn't here, but we can imagine it, and it does actually exist in this other parallel world reality. And as I was saying this, I forgot one of the most important influences on my life, which it's really hard to weight these, was The Death of Arthur by Thomas Malory. It would probably be in the top 5 influences on my life, because what Malory does, and I realized this after the fact. I read this when I was like, I don't know, maybe even middle school or early high school. That was part of my homeschooling curriculum. And I loved it. I loved it. The Grail Quest was great. Growing up, I wanted to be Galahad who found the Holy Grail. But the idea here is that what is Arthur? What is Malory's telling of Arthur? Well, I believe Malory's telling of Arthur is actually an esoteric alchemical text, where the Holy Grail represents the unification of the rational and the emotional. But with because that's one of the alchemical descriptions of the Holy Grail, of that is the Holy Grail, the sense of unification. But also in the case of Sir Galahad, moral purity, which his father Lancelot does not have. And he's the only guy that defeats Lancelot in a joust, because he is the greatest knight. He doesn't just unify reason and emotion. He's also righteous and pure, right? And what all of this is telling us is that in this quest for moral perfection, for a greater level of consciousness, you know, this is a complex allegory of how that occurs. And the failure of Camelot is the fact that Arthur, the love triangle of Arthur, Guinevere, and Lancelot, they fail. They fail at this. And what's kind of interesting is if you look at the alchemical description of the Philosopher's Stone, It's a circle, which contains a square, which contains a triangle, which contains a circle. And I think it's interesting that it's a love triangle that brings down Camelot. So it's like Arthur and the guys are close. They're 3 steps in. They've almost finished this, but then they all just go sideways. Whereas Lancelot, Sir Percival, and Sir Bors all see the Grail, and then Lancelot and then Galahad goes into the other world. That hugely influenced me as well, on par with Tolkien or Sir Arthur Conan Doyle. And that's more of a mystical, esoteric influence, right? Because if you look at not just Malory, right? Because I think this concept continues throughout English history, and you find influences in Sir Arthur Machen, in Tolkien, and other sources, where you have this kind of like man out of time esoteric Britain, where you have this man who is an adept in England or Britain, or depending on the context of the author writing, and he is not only brave and bold, but imaginative, creative, and poetic, right? And then he masters his own context and then ascends to a level of spiritual mastery. And I think this literary tradition begins with Malory as a kind of organized work, and then it dies after World War II with Tolkien and Lewis. So sad, but there's this idea of an Englishman who, on the one or a Briton or whatever, depending on the time of the author writing, because Arthur's a Briton. The idea of being at home in your own context, your own parochial context, but also having this world historical perspective. Lord Dunsany's another good example of this as well, where, yeah, he's English. Yeah, he represents all of this, but he has this world historical context. Robert Louis Stevenson as well has this as well. And so he sort of, what you see with these authors, Dunsany and Robert Louis Stevenson and Sir Arthur Conan Doyle and Machen and others, is that through reason on the one hand, right, and then also through emotion and perception and intuition on the other hand, you are able to build a understanding of how the world works from not just first principles of philosophy and religion, which they do, but also from a vast knowledge of historical sources. And so they create this unique flavor of man, where he's not only English or Briton, depending on the context, as I said, and masters his own environment, but has mastered time itself, because he has this knowledge, because he's a student of all of these things, which vastly exceeds anyone else, because he's aware of this. I mean, let's just say it. History is esoteric. Most people don't read it. So, yeah. Well, guys, that's a lot to chew on. It's a little over an hour, so I think I'm going to wrap this up. Thank you for tuning in. If anybody wants more discussions about books or a deeper dive into any one of these books, just let me know. This is Todd Lewis of the Praise of Folly podcast, signing off.